December 24th, 1967. The highlands of Con Tum Province, South Vietnam. Mist clung to the jungle canopy like smoke from a dying campfire, and the air carried the scent of wet earth mixed with the metallic tang of distant gunpowder. In the scattered American fire bases dotting this remote corner of the Republic of Vietnam, improvised Christmas lights flickered weakly against sandbags, their colored bulbs casting fragile rainbows across mud-stained concrete bunkers. The temperature hovered at 82 degrees, despite the December date. Humidity thick enough to fog rifle scopes and short-circuit radio batteries. A portable transistor radio crackled through static, broadcasting Bing Crosby's voice across fire support base. "Charlie, I'll be home for Christmas, if only in my dreams." Soldiers in olive-drab fatigues sat smoking Marlboros and Lucky Strikes, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of cigarette tips, trying desperately to pretend that war had declared its own temporary armistice. Captain Robert Ellison of the 4th Infantry Division's 3rd Battalion wrote in his leather-bound field journal that evening, his handwriting careful, despite the tremor in his fingers from too much coffee and too little sleep. For one night, perhaps, Vietnam might seem less like hell itself. The sound of distant artillery firing illumination rounds to the north served as a constant reminder that hell never truly slept, never truly rested, never truly observed the sacred traditions of peace on earth. But 50 miles away, in command bunkers hidden beneath triple canopy jungle, North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong guerrilla fighters were receiving very different instructions. Radio operators hunched over Soviet-made R-105 transceivers, copying coded messages in rapid bursts of Morse code. The orders were simple, brutal, and devastatingly clear. While the Americans sang carols and dreamed of home, the revolution would strike without mercy or hesitation. The American military leadership had announced a symbolic 24-hour ceasefire, a gesture designed to honor the Christmas spirit and perhaps demonstrate to the world that even in Southeast Asia's crucible of violence, humanity could prevail for a single sacred night. General William Westmoreland's headquarters in Saigon had issued careful directives to all field commanders: maintain defensive positions, observe the truce, but remain vigilant for enemy deception. Yet the overwhelming sentiment among American forces from the Mekong Delta to the demilitarized zone was a dangerous combination of hope and complacency. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez of the 25th Infantry Division's 2nd Brigade laughed as he hung an empty Budweiser bottle from a radio antenna like a makeshift ornament, telling his squad with confidence born of exhaustion and wishful thinking, not even Charlie would have the balls to attack on Christmas. His words would echo with bitter irony in the hours to come. But in the dense jungle 40 kilometers northwest of Con Tum, Colonel Nguyen Van Duc of the National Liberation Front's 304th Regional Battalion was coordinating what North Vietnamese commanders had designated Operation Truong Son, a calculated reconnaissance in force designed to probe American defensive positions while their enemies celebrated the birth of the Prince of Peace. The tactical concept was deceptively simple, yet psychologically devastating. Small guerrilla units, typically consisting of 8 to 12 fighters armed with Soviet AK-47 assault rifles, Chinese-manufactured Type 56 carbines, and RPG-2 rocket-propelled grenades, would infiltrate American logistical support areas during the supposed ceasefire. Their mission was not to achieve decisive military victory. That would come later, during what planners were already calling the General Offensive and General Uprising scheduled for the Tet holiday just weeks away. Instead, these Christmas Eve raids would serve multiple strategic purposes: mapping American defensive positions, identifying communication cables and mortar emplacements, testing response times and coordination between units, and most importantly, shattering the psychological comfort that came with believing in temporary peace. The North Vietnamese High Command understood that wars are won, not merely through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through breaking the enemy's will to continue fighting. The forces involved in Operation Truong Son represented a cross-section of the communist military structure in South Vietnam. Local Viet Cong guerrillas, many of them farmers who had taken up arms against the Saigon government, provided intimate knowledge of terrain and American patrol patterns. North Vietnamese Army regulars, battle-hardened veterans of the French Indochina War, contributed professional military expertise and standardized Soviet weaponry. Political officers ensured ideological commitment, while communications specialists maintained contact with regional command through networks of buried telephone cables and concealed radio stations. Their equipment reflected the eclectic nature of communist logistics in Southeast Asia. Kalashnikov assault rifles manufactured in Tula and Izhevsk bore Cyrillic markings that spoke of Moscow's commitment to revolutionary warfare. Chinese-made mortars, based on Soviet designs but adapted for jungle warfare, could be disassembled into man-portable components and reassembled within minutes. Ammunition arrived through the Ho Chi Minh Trail's intricate network of footpaths, bicycle routes, and hidden supply caches, each bullet representing a triumph of determination over American aerial interdiction efforts. As Christmas Eve deepened into night, American soldiers across South Vietnam's northern provinces settled into what they hoped would be peaceful vigilance. In Fire Support Base Alpha, near the Cambodian border, Specialist Danny Thompson from Pittsburgh strummed a borrowed guitar and led an impromptu rendition of Silent Night, his voice carrying across defensive perimeters where claymore mines and trip flares waited in patient silence. At Landing Zone Bravo, 30 kilometers southeast of Pleiku, medics from the 1st Cavalry Division's airmobile units shared canned peaches from sea rations and passed around photographs of wives, girlfriends, and children they hadn't seen in 8 months. The machinery of American military power in South Vietnam represented the most sophisticated technological force ever deployed in counterinsurgency warfare. UH-1 Huey helicopters, their turbine engines capable of generating 1,100 shaft horsepower, provided unprecedented tactical mobility across terrain that had previously channeled military movement along predictable valleys and ridgelines. Bell AH-1 Cobra gunships, bristling with 2.75-inch rocket pods and rapid-fire miniguns, could deliver devastating firepower with surgical precision. Artillery units deployed M102 105mm howitzers, lightweight enough for helicopter transport, yet capable of firing 18 rounds per minute at targets 15 kilometers away. Communication networks linked every American unit through a web of radio frequencies, telephone lines, and electronic intelligence gathering systems. The ANPRC-25 radio, weighing 23 pounds including its battery pack, connected squad leaders directly with battalion headquarters and air support coordinators. Radar installations at major bases tracked aircraft movements across hundreds of square kilometers, while signals intelligence units intercepted and analyzed enemy radio transmissions, using equipment so sensitive it could detect electronic emissions from transistor radios at distances of several miles. Yet for all this technological superiority, the American military presence in South Vietnam remained fundamentally vulnerable to the oldest form of warfare: surprise attacks by determined enemies willing to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of psychological victory. The Christmas truce of 1967 would demonstrate this vulnerability with shocking clarity. At 11:47 p.m. on December 24th, the first rockets impacted Fire Support Base Charlie near Kontum with the distinctive shriek of incoming artillery that every combat veteran recognized instantly. Soviet-designed 122mm Katyusha rockets, launched from portable tubes concealed in the jungle canopy, arced through the humid night air and exploded among sleeping quarters where soldiers had been dreaming of snow-covered streets in Ohio, wheat fields in Kansas, and Christmas morning surprises waiting under decorated trees in suburban America. The initial barrage lasted less than 3 minutes, but its effects rippled through American defensive positions like seismic shockwaves. Christmas lights went dark as shrapnel severed electrical cables. Radio antennas toppled under the impact of high-explosive warheads. Soldiers who had been singing carols moments earlier now scrambled for weapons and body armor. Their holiday celebration transformed instantly into the desperate choreography of survival under fire. Private First Class James Morrison from Detroit, who had been wearing a red Santa Claus hat while cleaning his M16 rifle, later recalled the surreal transition. "One second I was thinking about my mom's apple pie. The next second I was praying the sandbags would stop the next rocket." The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the physical damage. For American forces who had allowed themselves to believe in temporary peace, the Christmas Eve attacks represented not merely tactical setbacks, but profound betrayals of human decency. Simultaneously, 30 kilometers to the south, another Viet Cong unit struck the radar installation at Fire Support Base Delta with precision that suggested months of careful reconnaissance. Sapper teams, specialists in infiltration and demolition, had approached to within 50 meters of the American perimeter before launching their assault with satchel charges and RPG rounds aimed at the rotating antenna array that provided early warning coverage for the entire Kontum region. The explosion of the radar facility created a communications black hole that would complicate American response efforts for the next 18 hours. Without reliable electronic surveillance, helicopter pilots would be forced to rely on visual navigation through weather that alternated between monsoon downpours and impenetrable ground fog. Artillery coordinators lost their primary method for adjusting indirect fire, while Air Force forward controllers found themselves unable to guide close air support missions with their accustomed precision. But the most psychologically damaging attack occurred at Firebase Echo, where Viet Cong guerrillas had infiltrated to within grenade-throwing distance of the command bunker, while loudspeakers broadcast Christmas carols across the defensive perimeter. The juxtaposition of silent night, holy night, with the sudden eruption of automatic weapons fire, created a cognitive dissonance that would haunt survivors for decades afterward. Staff Sergeant William Hayes, a 26-year-old platoon leader from North Carolina, had been conducting a brief Christmas Eve service for his men when the attack began. Years later, he would describe the moment with painful clarity. "I thought it was some kind of equipment malfunction at first, maybe feedback from the speakers. Then I saw the muzzle flashes and realized someone was using our own Christmas music to cover their approach." The irony was intentional, calculated, and devastatingly effective. American response to the Christmas Eve attacks reflected both the strengths and limitations of conventional military doctrine when confronted with unconventional warfare. Artillery units immediately began firing counter-battery missions, sending volleys of high-explosive shells into suspected enemy positions identified through muzzle flash analysis and sound-ranging equipment. The 155mm howitzers of the 2nd Battalion, 32nd Artillery Regiment, unleashed a devastating barrage that illuminated the highland jungle with flashes of orange and white light, transforming the peaceful Christmas Eve sky into a hellscape of falling steel and exploding earth. UH-1 Huey helicopters, their crews awakened from sleep and scrambled into action within minutes of the first attacks, lifted off from landing zones across the operational area with rockets and machine gun ammunition loaded for immediate combat. The distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of rotor blades cutting through humid air became the soundtrack of American retaliation as gunships swept across the jungle canopy, searching for targets that had already melted back into the darkness. The irony was inescapable and bitter. Loudspeakers that had been broadcasting messages of peace and hope now transmitted target coordinates and calls for medical evacuation. The same radio frequencies that had carried Christmas greetings from families back home now crackled with urgent requests for ammunition resupply and close air support. Peace on Earth had died sometime between midnight mass and morning reveille. Another casualty of a war that seemed to consume everything sacred, everything innocent, everything remotely resembling human decency. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Anderson, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment, made the decision that would symbolize the end of any remaining illusions about Christmas truces in Vietnam. At aerosol to 30 hours on December 25th, he ordered the artillery barrage expanded to include all suspected enemy staging areas within a 20-kilometer radius of his firebase, effectively carpet-bombing several square miles of jungle where intelligence reports suggested Viet Cong forces might be concentrating. The decision reflected both tactical necessity and emotional frustration. American commanders had genuinely hoped that Christmas Eve might provide a brief respite from the endless cycle of ambushes, rocket attacks, and casualty evacuations that defined daily existence in South Vietnam. When that hope proved illusory, the response was swift, massive, and utterly disproportionate to the actual threat posed by small guerrilla units armed with portable weapons. M48 Patton tanks, their 90mm cannons loaded with high-explosive shells, rumbled through villages that had received candy and medical supplies from American soldiers just hours earlier. The same children who had smiled at photographs of American families and accepted chocolate bars from soldiers now cowered in bunkers, while tank treads crushed Christmas decorations made from empty ammunition crates and discarded radio batteries. Intercepted radio transmissions, monitored by American signals intelligence units equipped with sophisticated direction-finding equipment, captured fragments of enemy communications that revealed the psychological success of Operation Truong Son. One Viet Cong radio operator, his voice barely audible through atmospheric static and deliberate signal masking, was heard transmitting a message that intelligence analysts translated as, "The Americans believed in Christmas. Their faith made them vulnerable." The military effectiveness of the Christmas Eve attacks was minimal by conventional standards. Total American casualties numbered fewer than 30 killed and wounded, while material damage consisted primarily of destroyed communication equipment and damaged defensive positions that could be repaired within days. Viet Cong losses were probably comparable, though exact figures remained unknown due to the enemy's practice of immediately evacuating dead and wounded from contact areas. But the psychological impact proved far more significant than any tactical assessment could measure. American soldiers who had served multiple tours in Vietnam understood intellectually that their enemies would exploit any perceived weakness, including seasonal ceasefires and religious holidays. Yet the reality of experiencing attack during Christmas Eve services, while carols played and thoughts turned toward home, created a sense of violation that transcended military considerations. Dr. Jonathan Miller, a psychiatrist attached to the 44th Medical Detachment, filed reports documenting what he termed accelerated disillusionment syndrome among American personnel following the Christmas attacks. Soldiers who had maintained relatively positive attitudes despite months of combat stress began exhibiting symptoms consistent with combat neurosis, sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and a profound cynicism toward any expressions of hope or optimism. The Christmas Eve attacks of 1967 served as a dress rehearsal for the massive Tet Offensive that would begin 6 weeks later, during Vietnam's most important traditional holiday. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong planners used the December operation to test American response times, evaluate defensive coordination between units, and assess the psychological resilience of foreign forces operating far from home during emotionally significant periods. Intelligence reports declassified decades later revealed that Colonel Nguyen Van Duke's after-action analysis of Operation Truong Son contributed directly to the planning for Tet 1968. American forces had responded predictably with massive firepower and technological superiority, but their emotional reaction suggested that attacks during culturally meaningful times could achieve strategic effects far exceeding their tactical scope. The morning of December 25th dawned gray and oppressive across the highlands of South Vietnam. Humidity so thick that weapons required constant cleaning to prevent rust formation, and the air felt heavy enough to induce claustrophobia among soldiers accustomed to the dry climates of America's heartland. As sunrise filtered through triple canopy jungle, the full extent of the previous night's devastation became visible in the harsh light of tropical dawn. Bodies lay scattered around improvised Christmas decorations that now seemed obscenely inappropriate. A tree constructed from empty mortar shell casings, ornaments made from radio batteries and colored signal flares, garlands fashioned from communication wire and camouflage netting. The contrast between seasonal celebration and violent death created a visual metaphor that news photographers would later describe as the most powerful image of the Vietnam War's psychological destruction. At Fire Support Base Charlie, the main tactical operations center remained intact, but forever changed. Maps that had been decorated with Christmas ribbons now bore red marks indicating casualty locations and suspected enemy positions. Radio equipment that had broadcast holiday music 12 hours earlier now transmitted medical evacuation requests and intelligence reports analyzing enemy movement patterns. First Lieutenant Michael Adams, a 24-year-old forward observer from California who had coordinated artillery support during the night attacks, stood among the wreckage and spoke words that would be quoted in official military histories. "We tried to stop the war for one night, but the war had already forgotten how to stop." His observation captured the essence of America's predicament in Southeast Asia, the inability to pause, reflect, or find meaning in a conflict that had acquired its own relentless momentum. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual soldiers to affect American military doctrine and strategic planning throughout Southeast Asia. General Creighton Abrams, who would succeed William Westmoreland as commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, later cited the Christmas 1967 attacks as a pivotal moment in his understanding of revolutionary warfare's psychological dimensions. Traditional Western military doctrine emphasized the separation between military and civilian spheres, the importance of proportional response to enemy provocation, and the assumption that certain universal human values, including religious observances, transcended political conflict. The Christmas Eve attacks demonstrated that America's enemies in Vietnam recognized no such limitations, would exploit any perceived weakness, and viewed American cultural sensitivities not as admirable humanitarian qualities, but as tactical vulnerabilities to be ruthlessly exploited. The broader implications for American society became apparent in the weeks following the Christmas attacks. Newspaper coverage in the United States, previously focused on body counts and territorial control, began emphasizing the moral and psychological costs of fighting an enemy willing to violate fundamental assumptions about human decency. Editorial writers questioned whether American forces could maintain their humanity while fighting opponents who seemed to recognize no moral constraints whatsoever. Television news reports, transmitted via satellite from Southeast Asia to American living rooms with unprecedented immediacy, showed the aftermath of Christmas Eve attacks in graphic detail. Viewers saw soldiers cleaning blood from improvised chapels, medics treating wounded men while Christmas carols continued playing through damaged loudspeakers, and chaplains conducting funeral services beside Christmas trees decorated with empty ammunition boxes. The juxtaposition proved more powerful than any anti-war demonstration in convincing Americans that Vietnam represented something fundamentally different from their nation's previous military conflicts. Radio intercepts captured additional enemy communications that revealed the calculated nature of the Christmas attacks. Viet Cong commanders had specifically chosen December 24th because intelligence reports indicated that American morale was temporarily elevated due to holiday celebrations and increased mail delivery from home. The timing was designed to maximize psychological trauma while minimizing genuine military risk to attacking forces. One intercepted transmission, decoded by cryptographic specialists at the National Security Agency and later declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests, recorded a North Vietnamese officer explaining the operation's objectives to subordinate commanders. When the enemy dreams of home, he becomes most vulnerable to awakening. We must ensure his awakening is violent, permanent, and psychologically decisive. The cynical precision of this psychological warfare would be replicated on a massive scale during the Tet Offensive of 1968, when North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks throughout South Vietnam during the most important traditional holiday in Vietnamese culture. But Tet's psychological impact had been prepared by smaller operations like Operation Truong Son, which demonstrated that American forces could be manipulated through their own cultural values and emotional attachments. Military psychiatrists documented a phenomenon they termed holiday trauma syndrome among American personnel who had experienced combat during traditionally peaceful periods. Soldiers reported that Christmas music, religious services, and even photographs from home could trigger anxiety responses and combat flashbacks months or years after their Vietnam tours ended. The association between seasonal celebration and violent death created psychological scars that proved remarkably resistant to conventional treatment. Captain James Walsh, a Catholic chaplain who had been conducting midnight mass when Fire Support Base Delta came under attack, later described his crisis of faith in terms that reflected the broader American spiritual struggle with Vietnam. I spent years learning to comfort the dying and console the bereaved, but I never learned to explain why men die while singing about peace on earth. His words captured the theological dimension of Vietnam's psychological impact, challenging fundamental assumptions about divine providence and moral order that sustained many Americans through previous conflicts. The tactical lessons learned from the Christmas Eve attacks were incorporated into standard operating procedures throughout the American military presence in Southeast Asia. Holiday celebrations were thereafter conducted with full combat readiness. Religious services were held in fortified locations with armed security, and any announcement of ceasefire or truce was treated as potential enemy deception. The institutionalization of cynicism became a necessary adaptation to survival in an environment where enemies exploited every human sentiment. Engineer units began constructing defensive positions specifically designed to protect recreational and spiritual activities from attack. Chapels were reinforced with sandbags and concrete. Recreation areas were positioned within protective perimeters, and entertainment facilities included emergency bunkers accessible within seconds of incoming fire. The American military learned to celebrate Christmas, Easter, and Independence Day as if expecting imminent attack, because experience had taught that expectations of peace constituted tactical vulnerabilities. The intelligence implications of Operation Truong Son extended far beyond its immediate tactical scope. Enemy forces had demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of American holiday schedules, emotional patterns, and psychological vulnerabilities. This suggested either highly effective human intelligence networks within American installations or exceptionally detailed observation of American behavior patterns over extended periods. Counterintelligence investigators launched comprehensive security reviews that examined everything from mail delivery schedules to recreational programming broadcasts over American military radio stations. The possibility that enemies could predict and exploit American emotional states based on cultural observations indicated a level of intelligence sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about operational security in counterinsurgency warfare. Cryptanalysts studying intercepted enemy communications identified specific references to American religious services, entertainment programs, and holiday celebrations that suggested systematic monitoring of American activities. Viet Cong intelligence operatives had apparently compiled detailed profiles of American commanders, identifying their personal backgrounds, religious beliefs, and emotional attachments that could be exploited during psychological warfare operations. The Christmas Eve attacks also demonstrated the extent to which North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had integrated Soviet and Chinese military doctrine with traditional Vietnamese guerrilla warfare principles. The timing of operations to coincide with enemy psychological vulnerabilities reflected lessons learned from communist revolutionary movements worldwide, while the technical execution drew upon North Vietnamese army training programs developed in cooperation with Warsaw Pact military advisors. Weapons captured during subsequent operations bore manufacturing markings from across the communist bloc. Kalashnikov rifles produced in East Germany, ammunition manufactured in Czechoslovakia, radio equipment built in Yugoslavia, and medical supplies donated by Cuba. The Christmas attacks had been conducted by local guerrilla forces, but their equipment and tactical doctrine reflected the global nature of communist support for the Vietnamese Revolution. American forces attempted to develop countermeasures against psychological warfare operations, but their efforts were constrained by fundamental cultural differences between American and revolutionary political systems. American military doctrine emphasized the protection of individual rights, the maintenance of morale through connection to home, and the preservation of humanitarian values even under combat conditions. These principles, while admirable in themselves, created predictable patterns of behavior that could be analyzed and exploited by enemies unconstrained by similar moral considerations. The aftermath of the Christmas attacks saw a documented decline in voluntary church attendance among American forces, as many soldiers concluded that religious faith was incompatible with the moral requirements of survival in Vietnam. Chaplains reported difficulties in maintaining congregation numbers and noted that their sermons increasingly focused on existential questions about suffering and meaninglessness rather than traditional themes of hope and redemption. This spiritual crisis extended beyond individual soldiers to affect the institutional culture of the American military presence in Southeast Asia. Holiday celebrations became subdued. Perfunctory affairs conducted more from habit than genuine enthusiasm. Christmas decorations were viewed with suspicion as potential psychological vulnerabilities. Even mail delivery from home became a source of anxiety, as soldiers worried that emotional content from families might compromise their psychological readiness for combat. The enemy's strategic objective had been achieved through tactical means that cost virtually nothing in terms of personnel or equipment. Operation Truong Son required perhaps 200 guerrilla fighters, armed with conventional small arms, and a modest supply of rockets and mortar rounds. Yet its psychological impact undermined the morale and spiritual cohesion of American forces across multiple provinces, affecting thousands of personnel and contributing to the broader erosion of public support for American involvement in Southeast Asia. Intelligence analysts later identified the Christmas 1967 attacks as a crucial preparatory phase for the Tet Offensive, which would begin 6 weeks later and permanently alter American perceptions of the Vietnam conflict. The December operations served as both tactical reconnaissance and psychological preparation, testing enemy responses and demonstrating that American forces could be manipulated through their own cultural values and emotional attachments. By January 1, 1968, American military leaders had concluded that traditional concepts of seasonal truces and holiday ceasefires were incompatible with revolutionary warfare as practiced by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. No further offers of Christmas truces would be extended for the remainder of American involvement in Southeast Asia. The war had consumed another fragment of human civilization, another assumption about universal values that transcended political conflict. The institutional memory of the Christmas attacks influenced American military planning for decades afterward. Officers who had served in Vietnam carried lessons about the psychological dimensions of irregular warfare into subsequent conflicts in Central America, the Middle East, and Africa. The understanding that enemies might exploit American cultural sensitivities became embedded in military doctrine and strategic planning processes, creating a legacy of cynicism that extended far beyond the specific context of Southeast Asian counterinsurgency operations. Veterans who had experienced the Christmas Eve attacks reported recurring difficulties with holiday celebrations for years after returning home. The sound of Christmas music could trigger anxiety responses. Religious services evoked memories of violence, and family gatherings became exercises in emotional control rather than genuine celebration. The enemy had achieved a form of psychological victory that extended beyond the battlefield into the most intimate aspects of American social life. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a clinical psychologist who specialized in treating Vietnam veterans during the 1970s and 1980s, documented what she termed holiday syndrome among former combat soldiers. Her research indicated that exposure to violence during traditionally peaceful periods created psychological scars that were particularly resistant to conventional therapy, suggesting that the enemy's exploitation of American cultural values had achieved effects that persisted for decades after the original trauma. The Christmas Eve attacks of 1967 represented a microcosm of America's broader struggle to understand and respond to revolutionary warfare. Traditional military doctrine assumed that combat was conducted between opposing forces that shared fundamental assumptions about the rules of conflict, the protection of civilian populations, and the significance of cultural and religious observances. Vietnam demonstrated that such assumptions constituted dangerous misconceptions when fighting enemies committed to total political transformation regardless of human cost. The psychological sophistication demonstrated by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces during Operation Truong Son reflected years of theoretical development and practical experimentation in revolutionary warfare techniques. Communist military theorists had studied American cultural patterns, identified psychological vulnerabilities, and developed tactical methods for exploiting those vulnerabilities with minimal resource investment. The Christmas attacks represented the practical application of theoretical knowledge gained through careful observation of American behavior over extended periods. American military historians would later identify the Christmas Eve attacks as a turning point in the psychological trajectory of the Vietnam conflict. Prior to December 1967, many American personnel maintained optimistic attitudes about their mission and their eventual return to normal civilian life. The holiday attacks demonstrated that nothing was sacred to their enemies, that no aspect of human experience was immune from exploitation, and that survival required the abandonment of assumptions about fundamental human decency that most Americans had never questioned. The tactical success of Operation Truong Son encouraged North Vietnamese planners to expand psychological warfare operations throughout the remainder of the conflict. Subsequent attacks were timed to coincide with American holidays, religious observances, and symbolic dates that held emotional significance for foreign forces. The enemy had discovered that American cultural values could be weaponized against American military effectiveness through relatively simple tactical innovations. Military sociologist Dr. Robert Chen, analyzing the long-term impact of the Vietnam conflict on American military culture, identified the Christmas 1967 attacks as a crucial moment in the development of what he termed protective cynicism among American forces. Soldiers learned to suppress emotional responses to cultural stimuli, to view expressions of hope or optimism as potential tactical vulnerabilities, and to maintain psychological distance from anything that might compromise their survival instincts. The Christmas Eve attacks also demonstrated the effectiveness of small unit operations in achieving strategic psychological effects. The Viet Cong forces involved in Operation Truong Son numbered fewer than 300 fighters distributed across multiple provinces, yet their actions influenced the behavior and attitudes of the entire American military presence in Southeast Asia. This disproportion between tactical investment and strategic result became a recurring theme throughout the Vietnam conflict. As the new year of 1968 began, American forces throughout South Vietnam faced the reality that their enemies recognized no boundaries between military and psychological warfare, accepted no limitations based on cultural tradition or religious belief, and viewed American humanitarian sentiments as exploitable weaknesses rather than admirable qualities. The Christmas attacks had completed a process of moral education that many veterans would later describe as more significant than any tactical training they had received. The legacy of Christmas Eve 1967 extended far beyond its immediate military context to influence American understanding of asymmetric warfare, cultural conflict, and the psychological dimensions of political violence. Military academies incorporated case studies of Operation Truong Son into curricula on irregular warfare, emphasizing the importance of cultural awareness and psychological preparation for conflicts involving ideologically committed opponents. The attacks also contributed to growing public skepticism about military optimism and official assessments of progress in Vietnam. News coverage of the Christmas Eve violence, transmitted to American homes via satellite television with unprecedented immediacy, created stark contradictions between official statements about Allied progress and the reality of American forces under attack during religious observances. The credibility gap between government pronouncements and battlefield reality widened significantly following the holiday attacks. Congressional investigations conducted during the 1970s revealed that intelligence agencies had received warnings about potential enemy operations during the Christmas period, but had failed to adequately communicate these warnings to field commanders. The institutional failures that contributed to the success of Operation Truong Son reflected broader problems with intelligence coordination and tactical decision-making that would continue to plague American forces throughout their involvement in Southeast Asia. Yet perhaps the most profound impact of the Christmas Eve attacks lay not in their tactical or strategic effects, but in their transformation of American soldiers' understanding of warfare itself. Veterans consistently reported that the holiday violence marked the end of their belief in universal human values that transcended political conflict. The enemy had demonstrated that Christmas meant nothing, that religious faith offered no protection, and that the most sacred human traditions could be perverted into instruments of psychological warfare. This loss of innocence proved irreversible for many American personnel. The war had taught them that survival required the abandonment of humanitarian assumptions that formed the foundation of civilian society. Veterans returned home carrying knowledge about human nature's capacity for calculated cruelty that could not easily be reconciled with peacetime social expectations or traditional moral frameworks. The Christmas Eve attacks of 1967 thus represented far more than a minor tactical engagement in America's longest war. They marked a decisive moment in the psychological trajectory of the Vietnam conflict, demonstrating that revolutionary warfare could achieve strategic effects through the systematic exploitation of enemy cultural values and emotional attachments. The war had found a way to corrupt even the most sacred human traditions, transforming expressions of faith and hope into tactical vulnerabilities. 1 month later, the massive Tet Offensive would shatter remaining American illusions about progress in Vietnam and permanently alter public perception of the conflict. But the psychological preparation for Tet had been completed on Christmas Eve 1967, when American forces learned that their enemies recognized no boundaries between military and spiritual warfare, accepted no limitations based on human decency, and viewed American cultural traditions not as admirable qualities, but as exploitable weaknesses in the struggle for political supremacy. The jungle around Kontum reclaimed the abandoned fire bases within months after American withdrawal from Vietnam. Monsoon rains washed away the defensive positions, vegetation grew through ruined bunkers, and the sites of the Christmas attacks returned to the green silence of tropical wilderness. But the psychological scars left by Operation Truong Son proved far more durable than any physical monument to the violence. Veterans who had experienced the Christmas Eve attacks carried their memories through decades of civilian life, unable to fully explain to families and friends what it meant to have one's deepest cultural values weaponized by enemies who recognized no moral constraints. The war had taught them lessons about human nature that could not be unlearned, about the fragility of civilization that could not be forgotten, about the price of maintaining humanitarian principles in conflicts against opponents committed to total victory regardless of moral cost. In the end, the Christmas Eve attacks of 1967 represented everything that made the Vietnam War uniquely traumatic for an entire generation of Americans. The enemy had not merely killed and wounded American soldiers, they had demonstrated that nothing was sacred, nothing was immune from exploitation, and nothing could be held apart from the corrosive logic of revolutionary warfare. The war had consumed Christmas itself, another casualty in a conflict that seemed determined to destroy every assumption about human decency and universal values. The silence that followed the gunfire on that Christmas morning in 1967 was not the silence of peace, but the silence of recognition, the terrible understanding that some innocence, once lost, could never be recovered. American forces would continue fighting in Vietnam for 5 more years, but the psychological war had already been decided. The enemy had discovered how to turn American virtues into American vulnerabilities, and that knowledge would shape every subsequent day of a conflict that had forgotten how to end. How do we honor the memory of those who tried to pause war for one sacred night, only to discover that their enemies had declared war on sacredness itself? How do we remember Christmas Eve 1967, not as a defeat, but as a moment when American courage confronted an enemy willing to corrupt the most fundamental human traditions in pursuit of political victory? These questions demand our attention, our reflection, and our commitment to preserving the stories of those who served. If this documentary has helped you understand the psychological complexity of the Vietnam War and the price paid by those who fought it, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share these stories with others. The veterans of Christmas Eve 1967 deserve to have their sacrifice remembered, their courage honored, and their lessons preserved for future generations who may face similar tests of human dignity under impossible circumstances. The jungle may have reclaimed the fire bases, but we must not allow time to reclaim the memory of those who learned that even Christmas could become a battlefield in humanity's struggle to preserve meaning in the face of calculated cruelty.